The Malcolm Arnold Festival is coming back to Royal and Derngate very soon, and as you'll have heard if you've been a regular to the programme, we've been looking at the life and times of Malcolm Arnold with festival organiser Paul Harris. I'm just on my way to go and see him because for a while we're going to have a look at the life, the times and the places that make themselves important parts in the story of Malcolm Arnold, the man. Born in the town, educated in the town, and of course a man who wrote a great deal of his music in the town as well. I'm on my way to Paul to find where it all started, the birthplace of Malcolm Arnold. Sadly, the house no longer exists. The site has been redeveloped, but I think Paul will have quite a lot that he'll be able to tell us. Paul, morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Cliftonville and the start of our journey looking at the life of Sir Malcolm Arnold. We're here in Cliftonville. We're both looking around because actually our first venue in the story of Sir Malcolm Arnold no longer exists.
Sadly it doesn't. It was a house called Fairview along this road. It was evidently, well, we have pictures of it actually. It was a lovely Victorian, ivy-clad, large house, detached house, and that's where Malcolm was born.
What was life at home like? He came from a fairly big family.
Yes,
his father came from a big family too.
His father was one of six brothers. Grandfather William, who was Malcolm's rather austere grandfather, in fact. And both Grandfather William and William, Malcolm's father, were both shoemen. They both owned factories. They both owned the same factory to begin with, but in fact they fell out. Evidently it was rather an acrimonious falling out, and Grandfather William went off on his own, and Malcolm's father and a brother started up Arnold Brothers, a shoe factory.
So would Malcolm have been expected to go into the boot and shoe industry? If so, how much of a surprise was it that he turned to music?
Well, quite a big surprise, I think. His eldest brother, Aubrey, certainly did go into the shoe company. And I suspect it probably was expected, but Malcolm, as we shall discover, was not a terribly good schoolboy, not a very successful schoolboy, and things went off in a rather unexpected direction. Having said that, there was an awful lot of music in the family. Also, as we'll discover, both Malcolm's parents met through music, and many relatives were very musical, so I suppose, in a sense, it wasn't that much of an unexpected development.
What would home life have been like for the Arnold family? I mean, this is a fantastic place. It now overlooks where the General Hospital is, but what would the quality of life for the Arnolds have been?
The quality of life would have been extremely good. Grandfather William was obviously an extraordinary man. He wrote a book which he published himself in 1915. Which rather immodestly presents his own life story from rags to riches, and he made a lot of money, as did many of his sons. And I think the Arnold household was really rather well-to-do, and they had staff, they had a chauffeur, and I think Malcolm was brought up in very comfortable surroundings.
Very elevated in that case in social circumstances. We're going to go and have a look at a variety of venues in Northampton town, elements of Malcolm's life through the places that he lived, the places that he did some of his composition. We're going to head up to Kingsley Park Terrace now, St Matthew's Church. Yep. Malcolm's writing was so diverse. He wrote all sorts of things, including pieces for organ, and Stephen Moore is ready and waiting there to play a piece for us right now from the days of Malcolm's youth.
Absolutely. His very first work was written at the age of about 11 or 12, and it rather shows his support of the underdog, because it's called the Haile Selassie March. It is unfortunately lost. It was actually first performed in Northampton. We'll talk about that later. But it was when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, and he felt very much for Haile Selassie, the leader of Ethiopia, and wrote the Haile Selassie March. But he also, and almost all his early music, were either Christmas or birthday presents for his mother, and they were almost all keyboard works, as this one is.
All right, well, let's get over to St Matthew's and we'll get into our tour of Northampton from Malcolm Arnold's perspective. Paul, we're inside the most amazing building. Not many people get inside here, and we're about to have a bit of a performance of Sir Malcolm Arnold, especially in advance of the festival. Just what's the relevance of this particular place to the family?
Well, considerable relevance because his parents met here. They both had lessons on the very organ stool that I'm looking at the moment, and that's where the Malcolm Arnold story started, really. He then actually came here and performed often as a boy, and the organist here in about the middle 1930s, was a man called Philip Pfaff, who came over from Cambridge University, and he became Malcolm's teacher of music, not his instrumental teacher, and basically taught Malcolm everything he knew. And interestingly, amazingly, Philip Pfaff is still living, even though Malcolm has gone quite a few years ago and he was his teacher, but he was only a few years older than Malcolm at the time.
You talk about the organist of the time, and the organist and director of music right now, Stephen Moore, is at the keyboard. What is it that we're listening to right now?
Well, this is a little piece that Malcolm wrote for his mother as a birthday present in 1938, so that would have made him about 17, which was only about his second or third year of composition, so it's one of his earliest pieces. It's just a delightful, short, sweet little piece called Dream City.
Stephen, fabulous performance of Sir Malcolm Arnold, and a real treat in a building like this. You've got a fantastic place to be able to play, not only as organist but director of music as well.
That's right, we're very lucky here to have such a fantastic building, great acoustics, fantastic organ. It's a brilliant place to make music.
Paul Harris has just put in context the relevance of St Matthew's for the Arnold family. Do you get to play much of his music here?
Not really, very much. I mean, Malcolm Arnold was commissioned by St Matthew's to write a piece a very long time ago now, but it doesn't really feature in our repertoire anymore. It's a bit of a pity, really. So it was great for me to have the opportunity to play some of his music here.
His music sometimes can sound a bit discordant. There are some very interesting chord progressions that are in that piece of music. Does that pose any difficulties for an organist of your high calibre?
No, I mean, it's a great piece to play because it gives lots of opportunity for colour, and that's something which organists really relish, is the opportunity to play a piece which gives you so many chances to show off the instrument which you're using, and we've got a great one here to be able to do that.
And this, of course, has been the venue for the Malcolm Arnold Festival in the past, so maybe an opportunity to bring back a little bit more for the congregation in the future.
Let's hope so, let's hope so.
Right, so back in the car, having been into St Matthew's Church just off Kingsley Park Terrace. Paul, we're going to have a quick journey. It'll only take us a few seconds to get to where we're going to. A very well-known part of Northampton. It has relevance to countless people here in Northampton because the racecourse is one of the best-known venues of the town. Which aspects of Malcolm Arnold's life are we going to look at next?
Well, two, as a matter of fact. We're going to see his second home and also a school that he went to, rather curiously, 3 times, which both surround the racecourse.
All right, so the racecourse is where we're headed next. Right, well, that didn't take long. Here we are at the racecourse. And Craig Moore is just over my right shoulder. Let's go and have a quick look at it. Paul, it's quite an imposing building. Here we are on St George's Avenue looking across onto the racecourse. Mercifully, it's dry. The first thing that you can notice is that it's on the end of a terrace of houses, and it looks as though there's been some development with something put up in the 1950s or 60s. But this house, this view, this was the family home for Malcolm at what sort of age?
Yes, I think he was about 13 when they moved here. It's a big 4-storey Edwardian building, very imposing. And most importantly, it has a very large basement. The basement is the entire size of the building, and they used to use it for their jazz parties. The Arnold family, he had 4 brothers and sisters, or 3 brothers and a sister, all musical. His sister sang and played the piano, his brother Philip played the saxophone, his brother Clifford played the guitar, and they used to convene downstairs in the basement and have jazz parties and invite friends, and it was really quite the centre of attention for many years.
As a result, therefore, it's likely that would have informed certainly the early writing of Malcolm Arnold. We just heard Stephen playing a piece of organ music, and there are some sort of contemporary sounds to it, some modern sounds.
Absolutely.
That would have been influenced by home life.
It was, and it was very much influenced by his sister Ruth. His sister Ruth was a real child of the Roaring '20s, and she loved jazz. She dressed in the most modern clothes, had the most modern hairstyle, and she was a great influence on Malcolm. Whatever she liked, he liked as well, and jazz was the thing. He loved jazz as a child. He used to play it, and in fact played it all through his life.
Be interesting to see whether the people who currently live in that house actually know of its musical lineage. I would suggest they probably don't.
I don't know. I wonder. It's interesting that the house was actually on sale not that long ago, and I did actually look into seeing whether it could be bought as a sort of Malcolm Arnold museum, but it just didn't work, unfortunately, at the time.
Maybe not this time.
Not this time.
It'll come up again. It'll come up again. Right, it's a question of education next. We're looking out across the racecourse, and so many people from Northampton will have spent time here. Presumably Malcolm spent time walking across it to go from home to school.
Yeah, the school just opposite the racecourse, called Eaglehurst. It closed down, I think, in 1973, so it had actually quite a long history, and it was run by a man called Robert Phillips, who 2 things actually about him. He was quite a strict disciplinarian, and he liked sport, which were 2 things that Malcolm didn't like. So I don't know, I suppose it worked extremely well for him. And he had a very extraordinary time at Eaglehurst, because he went there 3 times. He left after a while because obviously the sport and discipline didn't suit him, to another school in Billing Road, run by 2 sisters, the Strickland sisters. That didn't work terribly well. He was there for about 2 terms, back to Eaglehurst. Then he went off to what was then the Town and County Grammar School, now the Northampton Boys' School, there for about 1.5 years, and then back to Eaglehurst again. 3 visits.
He just didn't settle where he was meant to be learning.
He wasn't really made for school. In fact, the stories go that he often used to, whenever it was raining, he would rush outside, take off his shirt, stand in the rain, and try to catch a cold, so that he could have time off school.
The educationalists must have absolutely loved him.
Well, I don't know. I don't suppose they much cared for those kind of people in the. We're going right back to the 1920s here, the early 30s, the late 20s, when he was at school.
But precocious talent, and he was, even at that age, he was expressing himself in a way of, this is what I want to do, this is the way I'm going to do it.
He was. I mean, the musical side of him came out very early. People think that he took up the trumpet when he met Louis Armstrong when he was 13 down in Bournemouth, where the family had a holiday in Bournemouth. But in fact, he bought himself, or parents bought him a trumpet when he was just 9. And he taught himself, in fact, at the very early times, and clearly was very musical from the word go.
What's coming across from our look at Malcolm Arnold's life is how much of an upheaval education seemed to be for him. Going from small places, I mean the Strickland sisters' place, you can still see the building, it's still there on Billing Road, it's opposite Northampton General Hospital. In fact, we're going to go to Billing Road now, and a rather bigger establishment.
Yes, this is the Northampton School for Boys, where he spent a reasonably happy 1.5 years.
The noise is kind of inescapable because we've come to one of the busiest roads in the centre of Northampton, Billing Road, upon which is hung all sorts of venues which have their own relevance to the life and times of Malcolm Arnold. Northampton School for Boys is where we've come. Now, in the modern day, it's got a great tradition of music, it has a great commitment towards music, and Paul Harris, we're standing outside the school with its attendant theatre and so on. An important part of Malcolm's early childhood and an important part of his education took place here, but as we found with the man and his music, a certain degree of eccentricity in character, and that also has a relevance to a story which certainly comes from his time here.
Yes, that's right. Well, in fact, music wasn't that important in secondary schools in those days, but the school did boast an orchestra. There were evidently only 6 boys in it. History doesn't actually relate whether Malcolm was one of them. 6 boys in the orchestra, yes.
That's not much of an orchestra.
No, I think there were many other people from staff and friends, but just 6 of the actual boys from the school. But at the time, he of course was playing the trumpet, which he'd started when he was about 9. And he also took up the violin around about this time, which he was taught by his delightful Aunt Belle, who was a bit of an eccentric. And one of my favourite stories on Aunt Belle is that she had a car, an Austin 7, and she never evidently got out of first gear, so she always drove very slowly, and because of this there was a tremendous smell of petrol. So she had the back seats removed, and in their place 2 very, very large vases which she would fill up with a huge number of flowers to overcome the smell of the petrol. And this was his Aunt Belle, and she would often sort of berate the young Malcolm for not practicing his violin, saying, I know you're playing the trumpet, and you obviously want to play that more than your violin. He would say to her, no, Auntie, I want to play the violin as well as you do. But of course he never did.
I said we're on one of the busiest roads of Northampton. In a sense, it's a fundamentally important road to Malcolm, because some of his schooling took place along this road and in more than one place.
Yes.
But where we're going to go next, a dark time of Malcolm Arnold's life, because just down the road from Northampton School for Boys is St Andrews, a place where he was a resident for a period of time.
He was indeed. I mean, things didn't go so well for him. I mean, there was, and this is a known fact, there was some mental instability, and this was there for a lot of his life, and he had treatment on and off.
All right, let's relocate, and we'll find out a little bit more about Malcolm Arnold's Northampton further down the Billing Road. Literally, we have come next door from school to St Andrews itself. It's an amazing building to look at, or an amazing complex to look at from the Billing Road itself. This period of Malcolm's life, I suppose, relatively speaking, you'd say dark days, but in terms of what brought him here, he himself admitted himself to St Andrews for treatment.
Yes, he did, indeed. It was entirely voluntary. And it happened in the late 70s, 1979, and things weren't going very well for him. He was in fact down in Bournemouth conducting the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra for some EMI recordings of his symphonies. And as I say, things didn't go well, and in fact he admitted himself here. He knew it well, obviously, from his Northampton days, and he was here for 2.5 years, in fact, during which time they treated him extremely well, and he recovered. And during the time, he made friends with a wonderful lady called Sally Charlton, whose husband was the publican at the Crown and Cushion pub in Northampton.
On the Wellingborough Road.
Indeed, and he met her because he actually went to the Crown and Cushion. Obviously, he didn't have to stay at St Andrews all the time. He was allowed to come in and go as he wished. And he met her there, and they became friends, and she actually got him back composing, because he hadn't composed, obviously, during the whole time he was here. And for a composer, 2.5 years of no composing is a long period of rest. And she got him working on the trumpet concerto, which he in fact then completed.
And which we can now hear in the background. That piece of music, from your point of view as Malcolm's biographer, was that a restart? Was it a rebirth for his creative talents?
It's very interesting that you say that, John. I mean, he was a different composer in a way after he left St Andrews. His mind wasn't as sophisticated in the way that he could use musical devices compared to beforehand, but it doesn't mean that the music is not of the same excellent quality and has the same quintessential Malcolm Arnold feel about it.
Equally, our attitudes towards mental health and mental well-being in the 21st century are distinctly different to what they would have been at the point when Malcolm admitted himself to St Andrews. Was it a brave thing for him to do? And what was the reaction of the music community? What was the reaction of the public to the fact that this fabulous composer was having troubles, was having difficulties, and admitted himself for treatment?
Well, it's an interesting question also. By the late 70s, he was not the centre of attention as he had been in the 50s and the 60s, where he was absolutely the most feted composer, and things had got a little bit gone off the boil a little bit for him. And in fact, when he did admit himself, I think very few people really realised that Malcolm Arnold had actually gone out of the public view for that particular period of time. After he came out of St Andrews and he started to re-establish his life again, it all began to grow, and he made prom appearances and wrote quite a lot of music in that last period.
All right, well, from St Andrews, we'll now head in towards Northampton Town Centre. We're going to end up at the County Library, but before that, a place that many people from business will know very well, Chain Walk Club, as it is right on the front of where Northampton General Hospital it is. We'll park up there, we'll talk a little bit about where Chain Walk fits into the Malcolm Arnold story, and we'll continue our look at Malcolm Arnold's Northampton. The sound of the trumpet concerto continues, of course, one of the huge number of compositions of Sir Malcolm Arnold. We've relocated, and as you can hear, we're in off the main road, we're in off the Billing Road, things are rather quieter. That's because we're standing in the entrance hall of the Chain Walk Club. Paul, it's the most amazing building. It's been here for a very, very long time. My father used to be a member of it when I was a nipper, when we used to live on Derngate. A place where Malcolm Arnold came, and again, a place that influenced some of his writings, indeed the piece we're listening to now.
That's right. In fact, the Sally Charlton, who I was talking about a few minutes ago, she was a member with her husband Brian from the Crown and Cushion, and they used to come. The Charltons used to come here almost every night after closing time. They would come and spend some time in the club, and Sally got into the habit of inviting Malcolm here for Sunday lunches when he was during the last sort of 6 months or so of his period at St Andrews, and they became quite regular frequenters of the place. But he then became a member, and sometime around that time, which is when he was in fact writing the trumpet concerto, he probably wrote some of it here. So we're probably standing close to a room where some of that work was written. Then a little bit later on in the Arnold story, he obviously left St Andrews and he lived with the Charltons for a while. And then eventually they had to find somewhere else for him to go. He wasn't in a good state actually at that time. And that's where they found someone to look after him. And he then moved off to Norfolk and spent the last period of his life, last 25 years or so of his life, in Norfolk.
So in terms of his social life, Chain Walk Club, it's a very relevant part of his life, and one of the last chapters before Malcolm Arnold left the town.
It is. It really represents the final chapter, actually, of Malcolm Arnold's Northampton. And it was. I think he had many friends here. And in fact, when Tony Meredith and I were writing the biography, we met quite a number of them, including the very person who found a carer for Malcolm who looked after him for the final period.
We've talked in the past about his humour, the humour that came out in his compositions, in his writing. Clearly he was a sociable man as well. He liked a good laugh. He loved to work with musicians. This would have been the epicentre of his social world in that case.
I think it would have done. And Malcolm was always mischievous. He had a wicked sense of humour, and he would have loved it here. He would have been surrounded, I suspect, by also people that would have enjoyed the good time, the good life. So I think he would have been in his element here at the Chain Walk Club.
Well, the restaurant facilities are still here. The sporting aspects of the Chain Walk Club are still here. The bar is still here. We're going to move to one final location on our quick trip around the locations of Malcolm Arnold's life here in Northampton, and it is a seat of books. It is a literary place, Northampton County Library. It has been the work of just 5 minutes to walk from Chain Walk and the Chain Walk Club to outside the main entrance of the library here in Abington Street, the main central library for Northampton. And although this is a place of books, Paul, this is a place of music as well, because just above us is the Carnegie Room, which has a certain relevance to Malcolm Arnold's writing, and there may be a bit of a question mark as to whether some of his lost music is here too, which we'll discover in a moment or two.
Yes, well, we will indeed discover that. And there's a rather nice connection actually between the club where we've just been here and the library here, the connection being the trumpet, because he gave some of his earliest performances on the trumpet here, and back at the club he wrote his last work for the trumpet concerto. So that and of course the two buildings span the two important connections with Northampton, the early one and the later one.
All right, it may well have to be a little bit quieter when we get inside. It is a living, breathing public library when all's said and done, but let's nip inside and see if we can't get close to the Carnegie Room, and another one of those venues that is particularly relevant to the story of Sir Malcolm Arnold. This has got to be in absolutely the very best traditions of the library community of Northamptonshire, because we're in hushed tones outside double doors into the Carnegie Room, which is part of the Central Library just off Abington Street. The relevance of this place is what to Malcolm Arnold?
Well, he used to give a lot of his early performances here in the Carnegie Hall here, and it was a time when he'd become great friends with a young flute player about the same age called Richard Adeney. And the two of them were great friends. They used to go on holiday together, and Malcolm wrote a lot of his early music for Richard Adeney, and two pieces particularly spring to my mind. One is a hysterically funny piece called A Grand Fantasia. I think he calls it something like Opus 793. It was only about the 10th piece he'd written. And it's a very funny piece, and it's a kind of world tour of music, and so you get a tango and a waltz and a Hungarian section, and it's a wonderful piece. He also wrote a sonata for Richard. They both liked French music, and so on the front cover he called it Sonata pour flute, which you would expect to be spelt P-O-U-R, as in the French, but he spelt it P-O-O-R, Sonata pour flute, which he thought this was very funny. This piece actually is lost, and I'm just wondering, standing here outside the Carnegie Room here, whether it's somewhere here in the library. Perhaps there is some drawer or cupboard. Well, it could well be. It has been entirely lost. We've never seen it, and this was the last place it was ever performed.
So we know it exists, and somewhere in a dusty recess of this library there could be an undiscovered manuscript.
Absolutely right, and I'd like to come here one day and just have a look through all their old dusty cupboards.
I think there is a challenge there, and I think before we get booted out by a librarian, perhaps we ought to decamp back into Abington Street. Back out into the hustle and bustle of Abington Street after the somewhat rarefied atmosphere of the library here in the centre of Northampton and overlooked by Washington and Fuller and others. Paul, this trip that we've been on, looking at various pieces of architecture that make up the story of Sir Malcolm Arnold, the festival is about to take place. The man can't really be separated from Northampton. You can take him out of Northampton, but his whole life really does have its stays and its visitations right back here in the county town.
Absolutely right. I mean, Malcolm Arnold is an important Northampton son. Born here, spent his whole childhood here, educated here, learnt the trumpet here, and then of course he went away, spent much of his middle life in London, in Ireland, in Cornwall, and came back here for that final chapter before the final chapter over in Norfolk.
It's entirely appropriate that we should be back in arguably the most bustling street of the town, Abington Street, because he was a composer of music for people. He wanted everybody to have access to his music, not to go down the elitist route of classical music, which had a certain pomposity about it, and even to this day, almost restrains people from enjoying it.
Exactly right. The people's composer. He always wanted himself to be thought, or he wanted other people to think of him as the people's composer. And of course, his influences were enormous, especially popular music, jazz, the popular music of the 20s and 30s. When you listen to his style, you hear this. It's there all the time. It infuses every note he wrote.
He had a certain kind of upbringing, he had a certain class of upbringing, but his music transcends all of that and is, as we've heard from what you and I have put together today with a view to Malcolm Arnold's world, what is his long-lasting legacy going to be? At the moment there is no blue plaque. He hasn't been gone long enough for a blue plaque to be put up, and indeed where he was born the house no longer exists. How should he be commemorated in this town, do you think, for future generations?
Well, I hope in all sorts of ways. It would be very nice to have a Malcolm Arnold trail. There's an Elgar trail and various other trails in the country of some of our important composers. And a Malcolm Arnold trail in Northampton would actually be very interesting. And we need perhaps a little booklet with it to tell the stories. And I think it would make an extremely pleasant afternoon's walk. Well, we can look forward to a blue plaque one of these days, which might be somewhere where his initial home was, or perhaps Craigmore in St George's Avenue. But there are so many of these places here that he had a very important connection with.
Just the ticket. I think there is another project on the way in that case, in memory of Sir Malcolm Arnold. Having said that, of course, we have a festival coming up in just a few days' time. Some of the music that we've heard today, there is, of course, the festival coming up. We've heard We've heard a tremendous amount of Malcolm's music on this look at the town. What else is on offer to people if they want to come along to Royal and Derngate and find out more about the man and his music as opposed to the man and his town?
Well, yes, we've got lovely music, as always. I mean, Malcolm was a composer of melody. He did all the other things as well, of course, but there is so much melody, lovely melody in his music. And we've got some of his vocal music in the shape of a world premiere, his opera The Dancing Master, on the Saturday evening, which is going to be extremely exciting. It's a bawdy comedy, which is why the BBC wouldn't allow it to be played when he first wrote it in 1952, but here it is now. And in fact, the theme of this year's festival is stage and screen. So we're having quite a bit of his film music. He was a great film music composer. In fact, the most feted of his period, worked this country and in Hollywood. We've got some of his ballet music. He wrote 5 wonderful ballets, and we've got Homage to the Queen, which is very timely, written in 1953 for the Queen's coronation, a wonderful piece, and in fact received one of its first performances in Northampton. So there's a great connection there. And we've got some of his smaller scale music, which is charming, and some of it very funny. We're doing his Fantasy for Percussion and Piano, which is a very funny piece. You can have music that is funny, that is funny.
World-class music by a world-class composer, played in the town of his birth. Why would you not want to come along to the Sir Malcolm Arnold Festival at Royal and Derngate?